Hi, and welcome to PHQ, Questions from the Personality Hacker Community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And let's get right to our question this week.
Hi, Joel and Antonia. I've been researching into Myers-Briggs for a few years now. Whenever I take an online test, I test out intuitive. I'm able to hold my own in intuitive conversation and get bored to death of small talk. However, I find activities that engage in sensation to be more comfortable and energizing than exploration. Let me also say that I think ISTP profile fits my thoughts and actions best. To note, I have gone through a stressful transition in the last couple of years, which could cause me to miss test. I also have a twin sister who is intuitive that I've grown up with, and she's an INTJ. So, after that long explanation, my question. I've heard you guys mention intuitives as bilingual, being able to speak both sensory and intuitive languages. Do you think it's possible for a sensor to also be bilingual? What would that look like? And would that make sense with my best fit genius? Best regards, Brianna.
Thanks, Brianna, for the question. Can sensors also be bilingual just like intuitives? We talk all the time about intuitives being able to speak a sensor language. You know, the intuitive sensor split, there are about 25% of the population are intuitive, and about 75% are sensor. And so as an intuitive growing up in the world, often you're surrounded by people who use either introverted sensing or extroverted sensing. We've talked about that in other podcasts. And you have to learn how to speak those languages to get on in the world, because that's how people are communicating. And that's how you have to show up and learn how to engage there. Now, sensors don't often have to learn the same thing. You know, they don't, unless you grew up in an intuitive house as a sensor, you didn't have to learn to be bilingual because most of the world is set up for you, and most of the people you engage with speak sensor language.
Yeah, and by set up for you, we don't mean like as an individual. We just mean as somebody with a sensory perceiving process. And so I think what happens, I mean, I have seen intuitives grow up in intuitive families and not be very good at speaking sensor language. I have seen that happen as well. But most of the time, I mean, if you just play the numbers, it's going to be intuitives surrounded by lots of sensors, and so therefore having to be bilingual. But I have seen sensors grow up in intuitive families and have to learn the same skills. So I think the answer to your question, Brianna, is absolutely, very much yes. And I think the other component that comes into play is as an ISTP, it means that your sensory process of extroverted sensing is actually your auxiliary, or what we call the co-pilot in the car model. And your intuitive process of introverted intuition is your 10-year-old, or what's technically called the tertiary process. And we have a much closer relationship with our tertiary process, or that 10-year-old, than we would with, say, our inferior or 3-year-old process in the car model. So I would say that a sensor that has an intuitive process as their 10-year-old, tertiary process is probably going to have an easier time of engaging in intuitive conversation and intuitive thought, because it's going to be a lot more, they're going to have higher awareness of it.
Yeah.
And I would also say that one of the ways that you can tell, like in our profiling sessions, and when we teach profiling to our students, we talk about gauging for the sensor intuitive split, not with whether or not they enjoy or even, participate in intuitive conversation, but what's their threshold for it? Like, how long can they engage in that kind of conversation before they lose interest or get tired or want to move on to something else? For intuitives, they seem to have almost endless amounts of space to hold for intuitive conversation. And it kind of works basically, if you look at the car model or the cognitive function stack, the higher up it is on your stack, the more engagement and enjoyment and threshold you have for that intuitive conversation. And the opposite could be said for sensory conversation. The higher the sensory cognitive function is on your stack, the more you'll have space to hold for sensory conversation and less for intuitive conversation. So if somebody's, say, an intuitive primary, which your twin sister is an INTJ, she has intuition as her dominant or driver process, and that means that she's probably been basically teasing out of you intuitive conversation your whole life. Like, if you had conversation with her, she probably really enjoyed that kind of conversation and wanted to have it with you. And she had very little threshold, if no threshold, for that kind of conversation. And I'm sure you went on the ride with her a lot, on that intuitive conversation ride. So she's going to have almost infinite amounts of space to hold for intuitive conversation. And then if you look at people who have their intuitive process as their co-pilot or auxiliary process, they're going to have a much higher threshold, maybe not indefinite space to hold. They might want to get into action or go do something else, but they're going to have quite a bit of space to hold for it. And then you go down to the tertiary 10-year-old process, and you're going to have some space to hold for it, maybe like an hour or two, and then you're going to maybe kind of get bored or want to move on to something else. And then if it's the inferior process, you're going to have very little space to hold, maybe 30 to 45 minutes before you're like looking at your watch and trying to determine what you're going to do next. So I think that the answer is definitely there can be a context in which a sensor is very much encouraged to speak intuitive language. And I think as an ISTP, with your intuitive process being the tertiary or 10-year-old, you're going to naturally have a higher threshold for that kind of conversation than you would if maybe you were an ISTJ with your intuitive process as your inferior 3-year-old. So yeah, the short answer is yes, and then the long answer is everything we just said.
Yeah. I mean, I think of my middle son, Sawyer, who's 8 years old right now. Now, again, he's young. Our guess is he is a sensor, an ESTJ. And the rest of us, our guess, the other two kids are probably intuitive like us, like Antonia and I. And Sawyer has to pretty much learn how to keep up with 4 other intuitives in the house. So he's surrounded by intuitives in the house. And I've noticed he's learned a lot of skill around speaking intuitive language because he's had to keep up with all of us. And we have to do a very careful job to make sure we're coming onto his turf as well. And so I think it's definitely something that if you grew up in that context, that is something that you probably have a little bit of skill around. And like Antonia said, if it's that tertiary or 10-year-old process, like my son Sawyer as an ESTJ, his 10-year-old or tertiary process would also be intuitive. It's much more accessible than at the inferior or 3-year-old position. So hopefully that answered your question, Brianna, and thank you very much for the question. If you're listening and you have your question for us or something you'd like to ask us about personality typology, personal growth, we love personal growth questions especially, you can go over to personalityhacker.com/questions. You can record your question. It can be played live on the air, or you can type it in and we can read it on the air and answer that there. I also want to encourage you to join our community of like minds. It's growing every day over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
You've been listening to PHQ Questions from the Personality Hacker community. We'll talk with you on the next episode.